Hello and welcome. Welcome to the 7th episode of Deep Noetics. Good to be back. I haven't streamed in 2 or 3 weeks now, but we're getting right back into where we left off. We're getting right back into deeper discussions on the topic of power. It's going to be a great show tonight, as we're getting deep into the questions around propaganda and mind control. We're going to be speaking about essentially the Matrix and about how the system is designed to control you and your behaviors and control the behaviors of us all in society. So, first, I will be talking about the notion of propaganda in general. As many of you may know, it was popularized by a man named Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays was related to Sigmund Freud and incorporated propaganda as a mechanism that would address and directly speak to the unconscious psyche of people, so the unconscious psyche of all of us. And in that way, engage in manipulation and control without that the people would consciously register and notice. That means, in a very Huxleyan way, Huxley wrote in his book Brave New World about a utopia, or dystopia, you could say, that represented a dictatorship that was based on pleasure rather than coercion and pain. It was based on controlling people through entertainment rather than through violence. So what we're talking about here in propaganda is control, which gives off the appearance of voluntary behavior, where people are being controlled, people are being enslaved without them even noticing, and in that way making the control and enslavement even more pernicious and even more intense. This all ties into the notions of the necessary sphere of politics and power as described by Jacques Ellul. I can very much recommend this author from Bordeaux, Jacques Ellul, an interesting character that is not all too known in general, but is definitely one of the best representatives of authors writing about power, specifically in the modern technological age. Before I get into it, I'd like to remind all of you to like this video and subscribe to this channel. If you like to support my work, also support it financially, go on to my Substack. All the links are in the description of this video. Also, if you want to support my work, check out my course on the philosophy of the machine or my upcoming course. Register, sign up for the waiting list for my upcoming course on power. If you're interested in the philosophy of technology, what technology is doing to us as humans, to our societies, then definitely check out the philosophy of the machine. And if you're interested in what I talk about in this show, specifically the topics surrounding power and all the various authors around it, you should sign up to the course on power, which is also linked in the description and will contain aspects that you will not find in this depth anywhere else. So, getting into the topic of propaganda, it is relevant that Bernays made an interesting statement, an important statement, namely that the managed control of public opinion in a democracy is necessary. What does that mean? If we assume a democracy allows an open playing field to some extent of opinions to flourish and engage in debate and be represented by, for example, political fractions or parties, then there definitely can be a certain spectrum inside of which opinions should be permitted and debate should be allowed. Chomsky often described totalitarianism as allowing vivid debate in a very narrow frame and a very narrow range of opinions. So, whereas outside of that narrow frame, outside of that focused area of permitted and allowed opinions, you have what lies outside of the so-called overtone window. You have what is dangerous to the cohesiveness of the society. Obviously, everyone can imagine opinions and movements and political parties that strive to abolish the democratic state as it is. And parties that strive to abolish it will lead to the end of the democratic state and thus cannot be permitted if one attempts to sustain the life of that democracy. And this is where we get to the famous tolerance paradox. You want tolerance, you want to uphold the principles of democracy, namely a vivid and wide spectrum of opinions protected under free speech. However, how do you protect this system from being taken over by those who have intolerant opinions, whose opinion, once dominant, abolishes all the other opinions? Of course, one could argue that if they reach a majority and that is the representation of the will of the people, then the abolition of these democratic principles, in a sense, was democratic and should be respected. However, the excesses of democracy leading to a kind of tyranny, as also described by Plato. If you want to know more about this, check out my other live stream about Plato and Aristotle. This kind of degradation of democracy can quickly turn into tyranny, as we've, for example, seen with the rise of fascism or communism in the beginning half of the last century. So, therefore, if we want to avoid the degradation into a tyranny, the democracy needs to be tweaked a bit. And tweaking it a bit means creating basically a permanent elite, in a sense, if we think about it, would also abolish democracy to some extent, as we're speaking of oligarchy then, rather than a democracy, or aristocracy if you want to be more benevolent to them. This means we have managers. We have people managing public opinion, people taking care and managing the public in such a way that they can still engage in democracy, they can still engage in free speech, but they do not step out of line. And this can be achieved in numerous ways, positive as well as negative sanctions. The most common positive sanctions would be pleasure-based, as was described in Aldous Huxley's book Brave New World. Pleasure-based reinforcement basically spreads the permitted opinions and spreads the message, or includes the message of what is permitted to think and what most of the populace is supposed to think, through the means of entertainment. In other words, through mass media such as the television and such as cinema or the radio. Mostly through entertainment, and most effectively through entertainment, through Hollywood movies about foreign wars and all that, do people get subconsciously conditioned into the right beliefs and into the necessary narrow spectrum of accepted belief. On the other hand, you can also have negative sanctions. Negative sanctions being dangerous speech, also referred to as extremism or radicalism, that is surveilled by an internal secret service or by the police and sanctioned once it crosses certain boundaries. Certain boundaries to free speech exist in most today's so-called liberal democratic countries, though to varying degrees. One could probably argue that the United States has the least restrictions when it comes to this. So, in the process of such a society, developing a permanent elite that manages public opinion, one needs to clarify the permitted spectrum of opinions. One needs to clarify what opinions and what ideologies are permitted and valid. And interestingly enough, this is an expert topic. This is something that is determined by professionals, by academics, by people that have graduated. And these people tend to skew in a, you could say, left wing, or in a you used to be able to say in a more socialist communist direction, as it directly engages in power, as the ideology itself, when it comes to leftist ideas, when it comes to socialist ideas, does entail a form of public management of the economy, or public management, in this case of public opinion, by people who are educated in the academic theories of socialism, in academically minded theories of socialism. In this, it is kind of irrelevant if certain representatives of these ideologies, most notably Karl Marx himself, or even people like Joseph Stalin, would have despised intellectualism and focused on the will of the proletariat or the will of the working class. We still have the more predominant expression of these ideologies being expressed more in a sort of permanent elite of academics and experts. What that means is we have these theories that are being, or these ideologies that are being expressed subconsciously, that directly address humans into their unconscious without them noticing it, and it is the cumulative effect of the mass media consumption. This is why it is a relatively recent phenomenon, as mass media is a relatively recent phenomenon. People would have not had the compound effect of masses of information being repeated, information at a low intensity being repeated often enough until it sets in on a subliminal level. That would have not been possible in times before mass media, as there was no repetitive exposure to information in such a way. Right? If you only go to Mass on Sunday, for example, then the priest has to make the message and the negative and positive sanction, reward and punishment, if you follow the right religion, has to make it crystal clear on that day, because those people are not going to be mass bombarded through their phones and radios with the same information again and again. Their main reception of that information happens only on that one day. Of course, there's multiple holidays, but that is just as an example. All right. So then we can observe two developments. Two things can develop. On the one hand, you can have the overtone window, the spectrum of permitted opinions narrow. You can have it become narrow, become more restrictive, more intolerant to deviations to the mainstream, so to say. Or you could have a development of the medium, the mass media, expanding, decentralizing, expanding in its sphere and expanding in its information spread. What I mean by this is specifically the transition from television to the internet. Television was highly restricted. It had a high entrance barrier to promote and create shows to distribute information. And that information was highly curated and highly specified. Especially now in the age of the internet, if you put on the TV again, especially with all of the commercials and all that, one does have this strange, eerie, you could say fake performative feeling when watching television. Because in contrast to the mass medium of the internet, you had every minute and every second is very valuable and needs to be carefully planned on television, whereas I can just turn on my live stream and start rambling and it won't cost me a lot. So the transition of the medium has also led to a widening of the spread of information, meaning that you can find any kind of ideologies, especially ideologies that would have been considered extreme or radical before. You can find them online. You can find your niche even with relatively popular, relatively successful people with multiple hundreds of thousands of followers or even millions that promote a certain ideology that would have not been considered within the mainstream or within the overtone window of accepted opinions. On top of that, the ruling elite, or the elite that manages public opinion, would itself become narrower and more intense and extreme with its message due to this transition of media. First of all, the more successful an ideology is in consolidating power, the more it is abolishing its own basis for power. In the words of Carl Schmitt, the most important political distinction is that of friend and enemy. And power cannot be seen as something that just exists as like some sort of thing or object. Power is a process that needs to be exerted to exist. If power is not exerted, it disappears. So if the English crown hasn't used any of its veto rights, any of its sovereign rights in 100 years, then it will become increasingly difficult for any monarch to make use of these rights again. In the same way, if power is not exerted by an elite against an enemy, against an identified enemy, and that is essentially when an ideology turns into a political formula. You have an ideology and that addresses and identifies the enemy within a society, and the combating, the destruction of that enemy is then explained or is then formulated in a political formula that is the justification for a sustained and maintained exercise of power against the political enemy. And the more successful it is, the more it abolishes its own grounds of existence. Meaning that if it succeeds in destroying its political enemy, then that enemy becomes increasingly less plausible as it has already been defeated or is weakened way too much to be a plausible threat to society. We see this perhaps in current times where over the last century or centuries, a kind of imperialist, patriarchal, white colonialist structure was being eroded, was being combated by the rise of a new academic elite, an academic elite promoting emancipation and liberalization and independence in certain respects. And that now the accusations and the critique of such patriarchal colonial systems has gotten, in a sense, more extreme by the mainstream, but at the same time less plausible. At the same time, there is a larger and growing backlash of so-called anti-wokeism. This backlash only being possible because of a combination of these two factors. On the one hand, the comparative abolition of the actual enemy, a comparative abolition of this, or you could say comparative weakening of this colonial imperialist structure that was being eroded over the past century, and at the same time an intensification of its attack on these structures, even though these structures have been severely weakened or have almost entirely disappeared. And on top of that, you have this widening of the media, of the mass media structure, leading to a breeding ground in which counter movements can flourish. And it remains yet to be seen whether this breeding ground will provide the sufficient basis for the growth of a new kind of elite. Whether that's going to happen or not is open for speculation, and I will not make a judgment neither one way or the other. But it is important to note that there is this combination of factors that plays a role. Not one of these aspects can stand alone. It is the combination of the development of the mass media technological system, as well as the development of the power dynamics within the elite. So, what this means is that the ruling elite will exert power through this new medium by bringing in its ideology that had dominated the last medium. Marshall McLuhan had already said something along the lines, I'm paraphrasing, that the content of a new medium is the old medium. So the content of the mainstream narrative, so to say, on social media, online, are often social media accounts and companies of traditional media, of CNN, of Fox News, of the New York Times, in the case of the USA now. And the narratives that are being promoted there are those that it strives to maintain against the onslaught of external ideologies now flourishing in this new medium of the internet. And as the political formula was focused in taking apart and deconstructing an old enemy, that enemy being this patriarchal white colonial enemy, it can only see its enemies now in that frame. So even though there is not really, or not at least not that prevalent, a movement that promotes white colonial patriarchal ideas or ideologies, at least not in its traditional form, and there is no real organized movement that maintains all the rituals and traditions of this kind of elite, the mainstream can not help itself, in a sense, but critique and attack opposing ideologies in this new medium with this accusation. Attack them with the accusation of being, as the common accusations go, racist, colonialist, white supremacist. Any of these terms should be already known by most people watching this, right? So keep in mind, I'm not saying this to make any judgment about any ideologies here. This show is specifically focused on understanding power, and specifically focused on understanding its structure and dynamics, and that will make it easier to interpret things either way that one positions oneself. So first, understand the basics about how power works, and then you can make your judgment about whether it's good or bad, or what should be done and what can't be done. Right. So the means of this new technology are means of control, whereas the means of the old technologies would be ones of discipline, you could say. It is a promotion of a kind of discipline and strong national culture, or strong, you could say, civic national culture of liberty and civil rights and human rights, whereas the new one is one of control. It is one of ecology, one of techno-ecology. The ideologies promoted, at least the economic ideologies, all focus on a sort of technological environmentalism, an environmentalism that focuses on new technologies, but also on credit systems, on feedback loops, on control mechanisms that strive to take control and manage the output and input of information, and in an economic sense, an ecological sense, the output and input of emissions of greenhouse gases, for example. So that means that this management is entering a mode of control that is a mode that is based on pleasure and the sanction and the withholding of pleasure. It is one that is not based on overt coercion, as the kind of elite that represents the leadership here would be described by people like Pareto as foxes rather than lions, meaning an elite that is rather meek and rules through soft power, through ideological power, rather than pure violent coercion. This means that whenever there is an exertion of power, it is not done by a raw, aggressive force, though in its most extreme case that is still there and necessary, but it is done by particular rewards and sanctions. And these rewards and sanctions can be the promotion of pleasure and the withholding of pleasure, which is in a society that is overwhelmed with input and overwhelmed with content, a kind of punishment, a kind of pain on its own, a kind of withdrawal, you could say, in a society that is addicted to an overflow of information. That means that the sanctions will occur in a way that it will that is essentially cybernetic, that is essentially inherent to the technological control system. And there it doesn't matter what kind of ideology is ruling. But the punishment are things like being locked out of your payment processor, being locked out of your online banking, being locked out of your social media accounts, being observed, being put on a watch list, being watched by various agents, but at a certain level it's probably not even agents anymore, but rather being watched by algorithms, being watched by bots, surveilling one's search history, surveilling one's browsing history, and nudging the results into a certain area. That nudging can happen or occur to bring people back into mainstream discourse, or to push them further into the extreme to then justify a criminal offense, or justify a kind of arrest and measures, that legal measures, essentially. So you have essentially a totalization of what is commonly referred to as a social credit score, a social credit system. And whenever one mentions that, one focuses on the Chinese system, but this is something that is inherent to the technocratic system, to the way the internet is structured today. It is inherent to it, and it is inevitable in any society. It is only most overt in Chinese society, but in a sense it's almost old school in Chinese society, as it focuses predominantly on civil offenses, on misdemeanors like littering and uh, civil misdemeanors of the likes, whereas a more sophisticated system would be based on further rewards, on a privatized structure and system of insurance, focusing on your health score or on social scores that focus on you maintaining and following the dominant ideology given by the academic elite, or for example an ecological score tracking the own emission output in terms of the environment. So these are some concrete measures, but essentially all of this does not imply that there are people that are fully in control of this. That is the paradox of this entire setup. The control is at the same time, the more control there is, the less someone is actually in control. Control becomes its own process for its own sake, that the more it is the system engages in it, the less there is an actual person controlling it. There is an actual person having full access to all of its mechanisms. As with the amount of information that is being outputted today, there is just no one that can be paid enough to look at all of this information. There's just not enough staff to manage and look through all of this information. All of this becomes automated, including the reward and punishment. The internet itself is already dying. It is already populated by bots, by algorithms. Algorithms there to represent various interests, but already haven't taken on a life on their own. A famous essay by William S. Burroughs called "The Limits of Control" exemplifies that. Control in its essence is not fully possible, and therefore this network, which is already building up an ideological illusion, it's building up a cage of information, and information is always distorting. The focus today on misinformation or disinformation is in a sense more honest, as it's no longer about truth and falsehood as purely technocratic systems do not really care about truth or falsehood, but only focus on information that is valuable to its processes, or information that isn't, in this case mis or disinformation. Mis and disinformation being entirely determined by a coherence to the dominant ideology, a coherence that doesn't care about whether this dominant ideology itself is in its assumptions true. It should be clear that coherence or consistency is not equal to truth. It should be necessary in expressing a kind of truth, but one can derive coherent claims from entirely false initial assumptions. And in the same sense, it is more honest to speak about information and misinformation rather than truth and falsehood. But it is also more dishonest, as information and misinformation don't really have a real distinction, as information always distorts in a mass media system, because our cognitive capacities are not capable of taking in all of the information that such a system could provide. Thus, it limits itself to a narrow spectrum that is selected by the network to be seen, and therefore distorts. It is distorted from an engagement that we would instinctually, or you could say inherently, seek with the world, and creates an alternative world. It creates a simulation of a world. In this context, I recommend Adam Curtis's documentary titled Hypernormalization, where he explains how politically in recent years such an artificial world has been built. In this sense, we are engaged in a simulacrum, in a simulation, or you could say a Debaudian spectacle. After Guy Debord's notion of the society of the spectacle, we are engaging in something that is not real and that is simulating a reality to us, and in that case representing a matrix. And the only way of cutting through that matrix, of looking at the foundations of that and what it's doing to oneself, is if one detaches oneself. And that is important, that is crucial. It is almost like a kind of techno-Buddhism. If one detaches oneself from the pernicious subversion of the machine, from the enticing and radical, virulent excesses and attempts of this machine to pull and drag one's attention towards certain ideologies, and the more radical those ideologies, the less they really matter. That is, again, crucial of what Jacques Ellul had already said about the technocratic system. That is the politicization. It is the more there is polarization, the more there is radicalism in those ideologies in the network, the less they really matter, the less impact they have on the actual society, and the more they are just a means to the end of the control system to be engaged in the control system. As long as you engage in the machine, as long as you fight your wars, your ideological wars within the machine, it doesn't matter what ideology you subscribe to, it serves the silent ideology that has invaded all of our minds, that the machine is promoting and that the machine is already implanting into all of our cognitive systems. In that sense, it is crucial to understand the mechanisms by which this is happening. And it is crucial to understand that the more radical these ideologies, the less they will essentially end up mattering. Of course, there are exceptions, and I'm not saying that we are in a kind of techno-dystopian end of history. Nothing can be changed, nothing ever happens. It's so over. But it is important to realize how much of one's energy, attention is a kind of energy, how much of one's energy is dissipating by investing that energy and basically draining that energy into a technological network that is using that energy to promote its own dynamics and to promote its control over oneself. It controls oneself by alienating oneself from people of other ideologies, from people of other, you could say, internet bubbles, internet cocoons, information cocoons that feed information, and at the same time creating a kind of radicalism that justifies a control network of surveillance, a control network of legal sanction against excesses of ideology. In that sense, we are engaged regardless of what we claim the dominant ideology is, what we claim the political ideologies are. We are engaged in a more subliminal, more general ideology of the machine, something I call the silent ideology of the machine. That has been explained thoroughly by media theorists, specifically Marshall McLuhan or Neil Postman, speaking of mass media as a kind of epistemology. Mass media as a kind of, you could say, additional layer to our cognitive system. We've got the limbic system, the midbrain. We've got the neocortex, and then on top of it, we've got the technocortex. And increasingly, this technocortex is becoming real. We're seeing the rise now of bio and neurotechnologies, of a merging of technological structures with our biological tissue. And I can report on this specifically, as I have studied neuroengineering. If you want to check out my latest article on my Substack, it does focus on the specific problems involved in brain-computer interfaces, in the connection of humans and technology. So that is what is happening. It lies within the modes of and within the modes of our system, within the dynamics of our system. It is inherent in its process that we have a technologization and an invasion of the control system into our personal lives, which has already occurred, but then also into our biological tissue. And in that sense, you can have a streamlining of information right into the cognitive system, something that will inherently change the way our self operates, the way we see ourselves, and it will fundamentally change the way we think, the way we formulate sentences. For example, if we try to output certain thoughts, then these thoughts will be decoded by language models that have not been trained on our thoughts. They have not been developed based on the way we think or the way we speak, or we individually in the way I speak or think. They have been trained on masses of data, on masses of text. And text, especially huge corpora of text from the internet, from various databases, and their statistical correlations are not how we learn language, and they're not how our thought is structured. So once our thought and once our internal language is being decoded from our cognitive systems, from our cortex, from our brains, we have a fundamental distortion, a distortion that is essentially the same distortion I've been speaking about thus far, the distortion of information in the mass media, but it'll be an even deeper ingrained distortion, a distortion that even distorts one's own thoughts. One's own thoughts are already distorted to the extent that they're engaged in and draining energy towards the paths laid out of the technocratic control system, but it will go even further once the technocratic control system basically outlines the path in which thoughts are essentially outputted from the cognitive system directly. So this may be going a bit deep, but it is crucial to understand that from within the ideologies that we observe, we have a silent common theme of a belief in progress. And this progress is not what we may colloquially understand as social progress or social justice. It increasingly becomes clear that it is a cold and a pervasive technological progress. And by that I don't just mean the adaptive improvement of technological devices or the improvement in computing power, but the increasing management and the increasing control of populations by algorithms, by processes that are following a cold, a rational, calculating structure. And this is almost a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that it is inevitable, but it is only inevitable as long as we follow this silent ideology of the machine. And to make it clear what I mean by that is the ideology of the machine is it pertains to a ritual, right? If you look at religions, for example, their core element usually is a ritual. It's not necessarily what is written in the books, but it is specifically the ritualistic practice of a religion. And what do all people have in common, whether radical extremists of the left or the right or Islamism or whatever online, what they all have in common is they all pick out their phones in the morning, they all go online on their computer. All of them do that every day, every morning. All of them engage in the same ritual. Just as you could say, for example, Muslims would be praying at the same time in one direction, everyone across ideologies in our technologized society is engaging in the same ritual every day, all the time. So, what can be taken from this is that mind control, propaganda, is not something that necessarily stems from a human source and then remains in its original purpose. It is something that develops and that grows into its own dynamics, specifically when we attribute autonomy and agency to technology as we're doing nowadays. I'd like to remind you as well, if you have any questions or any comments, please let me know. I like reading your comments. I like reading your feedback. Please let me know if you have any criticisms as well, if I should speak more clear, if I'm not explaining things enough, or if I should slow down, or if I'm too slow. Please let me know all your feedback. I'd like to remind you as well to subscribe and leave a like. And if you want to support my work, I'd like to remind you to check out my Substack and support me financially there. Check out my articles. Also, if you want to sign up for one of my courses, Philosophy of the Machine on technology on Halcyon Guild, link is in the description, or the upcoming course, you can sign up for the waiting list coming up, the course on power, which we are speaking about in most episodes of this live stream series thus far. So, to look back at what we've discussed so far, we have been speaking about the political aspect, namely the aspect of a particular ideological elite that formulates a political formula to exert power against its political enemy, and the combination of that factor with the technological structure of mass media. And in that sense, this convergence that we have of an elite with the mass media mirrors the convergence that our society has with the control system that has expanded from this mass media. And this control system is in turn expanding and growing into our cognitive systems, whilst at the same time the dominant ideology becomes more invasive, more pernicious, more extreme, whilst at the same time allowing for a wide range of radical political ideologies online to proliferate and flourish, as the actual contents of an ideology no longer matter, since we've entered a state of management control, but it is rather the pure engagement and the pure belief in this technocratic system and the pure belief in a technocratic structure of society that maintains it and that brings about, in a self-fulfilling way, a kind of convergence of the control system and our own human biological tissue. Now, this may be a lot to digest for now. If you have any comments, any remarks, please let me know in the comments. And I would like to thank you for your attention. And I will see you next time on my next stream. On Thursday, I will be streaming with Robert Morris, who was on my channel before. Really looking forward to that. Thursday should be a good stream. We'll be talking about global power. He's a global politics expert. Should be talking about global power and its conflict and opposition to a very different kind of power, namely that of political Islam. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.